Hi dudes and dudettes, it's me, E08, and this is another podcast of The Radical Reset, the voice of Antipolitism. Today, I'm going to talk about three things that are probably about as far from your mind, and you would wonder why I would choose these three subjects, because they're about as exciting as a popcorn fart until you really understand them. How exciting is a popcorn fart? Anyway, but the things that will do us in the end, are usually not the things we're paying any attention to. So my goal here is simply a brief 30-minute or less education so that you can be better informed, so that if one day you're called upon to lead, you know what it is you're talking about. And those three subjects today are taxation, regulation, and administrative law. God, that sounds like, like the world's most boring accounting course in college. I know. So I'm going to attempt to make this as entertaining as possible, and why it's relevant to your life, and why you should even give a fuck. Okay, but before I go on, and before I bore you, and before you go to sleep, please click on the subscribe button. See, isn't it, first I downplay everything I'm about to say, and then I tell you, please click on the subscribe button, and share this with your friends, and click on the notifications, and pick up your copy of A Radical Reset, the Manifesto of Antipolitism, free for you to download, or you can order it reasonably in paperback from the Amazon Kindle library. So, okay. Let's start with taxation. And in particular, when I say taxation, I'm going to begin with income taxation. Now, the first thing to understand is the income tax, although it seems like an everyday part of all of our lives, actually, for the first 130 years of the American Republic, didn't exist. The government got its money just on tariffs and fees, mostly on imports and exports. Okay, that's where the federal government got all its money, because the federal government did very, very little in comparison with what it does today. But in 1909, the 16th Amendment was passed by Congress and then sent to the states for ratification, and then passed in 1913 to allow the federal government to institute an income tax. Now, Woodrow Wilson, may God rot his soul and burn him in hell, the worst president, in my opinion, in U.S. history, worse in the sense that he created the most destruction and the most death and mayhem in his wake, another discussion for another day, wanted the income tax basically to fund the U.S. intervention into World War I. So he instituted an income tax right after the amendment was passed. It was supposed to be temporary, just to pay for the war, 1914 to 1918. But in fact, it was not temporary, and it exists today. And that's why most of us, when we take home our paycheck, no matter what we make, we really don't make it, because money comes out of it to pay for some things that benefit us, like Social Security ultimately, which is the FICA tax, and some things that don't benefit us, like most of what the government does. Okay, so here's the thing. The question, and of course, coming out of this COVID crisis, which is the period in which I'm creating this video, we're spending trillions, with a T, of dollars that we don't have. We're printing them out of thin air, and we're borrowing them from, I always love it when they say we have to borrow the money. It's a Ponzi scheme. The borrowing means the Federal Reserve is printing up the money and the Treasury is borrowing it and giving back the Federal Reserve Treasury notes, which if I would have done that, I'd still be in prison for the rest of my life. The greatest Ponzi scheme in history. But having said that, at some point we're going to have to balance these books or collapse. I don't really believe we're going to balance the books, so I really think collapse is coming. But having said that, here's what the argument is going to be. What's going to happen here in the wake of COVID, believe me, is that the Congress, particularly the Democrats, will start clamoring for higher taxes on the wealthy. Now, in the introduction to this video, so I'm not going to repeat it, I show that, for example, the top 5% of income earners, and this is from Kiplinger, my source was Kiplinger, which is a completely neutral source. They just did a chart based on who pays income tax. 59%, almost 60% of income tax is paid by the top 5%. And the top 50% pays virtually all income tax. Poor Mitt Romney, who said that as a truth when he was running against Barack Obama, was pilloried in the press for saying the truth, but since when is truth allowed in the politically correct world we live in? Anyway, the question is, should we be taxing income at all? And if we lived in an anti-political government, what would we be taxing? And in A Radical Reset, the book that you can download for free from Amazon, I propose a national sales tax to replace the income tax, a national sales tax of 10%. Now, this has been discussed before under the heading of what's called the FAIR tax, F-A-I-R, which is an acronym that I don't know what it stands for. But anyway, The idea behind the fair tax is it's a national sales tax, but it excludes things like food and clothing because it regressively, that's the word they use, taxes poor people. Now, if we had a national sales tax the way I propose it, which is 10% without exclusions, it would raise about $2.5 trillion a year because we have about a $22 to $25 trillion economy. So basically we would raise about $2.5 trillion a year on sales at all. And this sales tax would be applied on both retail and wholesale sales. It would be across the board. So it would raise a lot of money. So in other words, what a national sales tax means is we're taxing consumption, not income, because when you tax income, you're discouraging people from saving and investing. As we went into this COVID crisis, a lot of people were living hand to mouth, and a lot of the reason for that is they don't take home everything they make. And so when money comes out for taxes before anything else, you're left with what you're left with, and if you don't have enough, to save, you don't. But if we had a national sales tax, you would take, if you made $3,000 a month, you'd take home $3,000. If you made $5,000 a month, you'd take home $5,000. No matter what you took home, you would take that home. Now, the rich would pay more tax than the poor because the rich buy more shit than the poor. So every time a rich guy bought a Mercedes, and every time a rich guy bought a yacht, and every time a rich guy bought, a designer handbag for his wife, or she bought designer golf shirt for her husband, or whatever the fuck it might be, they would all be paying sales tax based on the value of what they're buying, and they generally don't tend to give a shit when anything costs, so they would pay more tax than everybody else. Now, the argument against this is, of course, that the poor people would be paying tax on clothing and food. And I'm here to tell you that one of the stupid things we've done is introduce the concept of fairness into anything that we do in government. The idea that there can be such a thing as an unfair tax. Bullshit. If you take poor people take disproportionately more benefits than anybody else, they need to pay for them like everybody else. That's the way it has to work. This bullshit, what is fair? It's such a subjective judgment. So in my view, everything gets taxed, and the poor people pay taxes too. And what do they do about that? They stop being poor. I've said this before, I'll briefly say it again. You only have to do 3 things in America not to be poor. You have to finish high school. How hard is that? You have to not have children unless you're married. How hard is that? And you have to not get married before you're 21 years old. If you can do those 3 things, you will not be poor in America. So the fact that you are poor reflects bad decisions. And just yesterday I was just walking and talking to a guy that had read my book, and he said to me, your book seems angry. And I said, why does it seem angry? And he said, because you go after poor people. And I said, you're fucking right to go after poor people. Look, this idea that there can be people entitled to benefit for doing nothing but breathing has got to be something that we chuck out. I don't go after them in the sense that I hate poor people. In fact, I'm all about creating opportunity for poor people so they don't have to be poor. But if you can't do those 3 simple things, if you can't finish high school, we're talking public high school, how tough can it be? If you can't avoid impregnating, a girl, or becoming pregnant if you are a girl before you're 21 years old and married, it's hard for me to summon sympathy for your own bad decisions. All 3 of those things are choices. And they're simple choices, and they're choices that the vast majority of Americans make correctly. So the fact, and you don't even have to get all 3 right. You can get 2 out of 3 and be okay. But, I'll tell you what, do your own informal poll. Talk to people who are poor, and find out if they've done any of those 3 things. And you're going to find out they haven't. And then ask them who chose. And they're going to, they always start. When I went to prison, one of the things I always used to love was to ask, how did you end up here? How did you end up at the bottom of the barrel? And the story always began with, you see, what happened was, as if it happened to somebody else other than themselves. But anyway, back to the sales tax. Not only would a national sales tax raise about $2.5 trillion that we know about, but it would raise untold money we don't know about, because the so-called black market economy, from the drug dealers to the bank robbers to the prostitutes to, you name it, who all have money that they're not reporting in taxes, all buy shit. And all of that money would be subject to taxation. So we would, in effect, be taxing criminals as well. And you know what? They live in the United States. They got to pay taxes too. Of course, I had a whole long discussion on crime and what should be a crime and what shouldn't be a crime, and you can watch those 2 videos. They were earlier in the series, parts 1 and parts 2 and 3, which are actually 2 podcasts. 2 and 3 I did in the second podcast. I encourage you to watch them. But anyway, that's why a national sales tax makes the most sense. It taxes everything equally, and it taxes income. Investments shouldn't be taxed. Look, let me explain why raising taxes on rich people is stupid, particularly under the income tax. Ask yourself this question and answer it honestly. Would you not agree with me that most rich people are employers? In other words, in one way or another, a rich person employs people, whether it's a rich lady who's got a trust fund and she employs a housekeeper or a staff in her house, or whether it's a rich woman who graduated from college, rose to the top of the corporation and runs everything and has thousands of employees, or man, it doesn't matter. Obviously, it's gender neutral. It's a rich person, generally speaking, whether it's a doctor, lawyer, or factory head, or just a trust fund baby. Every rich person employs people. And ask yourself if that's true or false. And of course, the answer is it's true. Now ask yourself this question, or ask yourself if this is true, I should say. Most middle class people are employees. I think that's irrefutable. Most middle class people are employees. And now ask yourself this question. How does taking money from the rich create more or better paid employees? It doesn't. Look, all the income tax does, a graduated income tax, in other words, one that taxes the rich more than the poor, as the chart that I posted from Kiplinger's in the summary about this particular episode proves, basically it takes money from the deep end of the pool, water from the deep end of the pool, to use a metaphor. It carries it, the government, it being the bureaucracy of the government, it carries it to the shallow end of the pool. Along the way, it spills a third of it, because about a third of government is wasted money and administrative costs, and then it dumps it back in the pool. And then the money in the shallow end goes right back to the rich end, because the rich people make smart decisions and the poor people make shitty decisions. Back to the three key decisions. Three simple decisions. I'm not going to repeat them again. But poor people don't make those decisions, so inevitably the water flows back to the rich people who make intelligent decisions, and to the middle class people who make some smart decisions and some dumb decisions. And actually I think it's a healthier way to live. We all do dumb shit, but I personally don't see anything. I have no great need to be rich, because I don't want to basically be a workaholic, and there's a price to be paid in most cases to be rich, unless you're unbelievably lucky and your parents die and leave you a huge trust fund. But I put that aside for the moment. So that's where I stand on income tax. There should be a national sales tax. Now, that would not raise as much money as we are currently raising from the income tax, which only means that we need to reduce the size of government, which I am not going to go into in this video, but I go into at length in a radical reset. But we could easily trim our sails, live within our means. Listen, if the government can't get along on basically 10% of gross domestic product, then it shouldn't exist. And by the way, it got along on a lot less than that for many years, until we decided that we had to pay poor people to have babies out of wedlock and then destroy and create a welfare state that we can't afford, and we need to drastically cut back. I'm sorry, I'm not a politician, so I'm not going to mealy mouth it and talk about it like we don't have to. Now, the second area is regulation. Regulation costs the U.S. economy about 10% of GDP each year. In other words, of our 22 to 25 trillion, depending on whose figures you read, gross domestic product, another 2.5 to 3 trillion is spent complying with regulations. Now, these regulations are issued by faceless and nameless unelected bureaucrats in federal and state agencies across America without anyone to tell them no, and places burdens upon business, and 99% of them are completely useless. Now, let me make this very, very clear, okay? I am not an anarchist. I think government is necessary for some things, and I think some regulation is necessary, because there will be crooks, and there will be polluters, and they have to be regulated. I understand that, just to use those two examples. And of course, there has to be laws against some things and regulations against others. However, anyone who's been in business, any of you watching me now knows that we as business people, and I was in business for over 40 years, comply with a myriad of regulations that are just stupid, because good business operates without them anyway, and would do all this exact same thing. Let me use an example. The Occupational Safety and Health Act, OSHA, okay? Now, if you look at the OSHA rules, those of you who have ever, I at one time was developing real estate, so obviously I had people out there building buildings and doing so on and so forth. There have to be safety rules. There has to be, the right way to use tools. There has to be, helmets worn when things can drop on your head, et cetera, et cetera. And there are regulations about all of this, down to, there's actually an OSHA course on how to use a hammer. I shit you not. Now, to get these courses and to implement these courses and to take time out of the day to teach these courses and to require these regulations and to keep these records, which you have to keep on the job site and in your headquarters, and be subject to SNAP inspection by an OSHA inspector, and then be subject to heavy fines if you're not in compliance, and to get pre-qualified in other situations, and it's all dependent on the industry, and regardless of what industry you're in, I don't give a shit if you're running a Subway sandwich shop, or whether you're running a law office, or whether you're running a medical clinic, or whether you're building apartments, or hotel rooms. It doesn't, you name it, there's a myriad of OSHA, just OSHA alone, Occupational Safety and Health Act, administration as well. OSHA is the administration that administers this, and they act and issue wild amounts of regulation that cost a fortune. Now, here's the question. Put yourself in my shoes as a developer. Would it have been smart to subject my employees to unsafe work conditions? In other words, first of all, am I going to hire idiots who don't know how to use a hammer? Or a saw, or a drill, or, in other words, we hired qualified professionals, right? Bricklayers that knew how to lay brick, carpenters who knew how to use a hammer, electricians who knew how to deal with electricity. Telling them how to do it again and making them prove to some government regulator that these were subcontractors, obviously, that they know how to do it, and then make the general contractor responsible for that, when good business would tell you that we would keep our employees safe because it's expensive to keep hiring new employees. Guys, I hate to tell you, replacing people, that's only in the movies where the boss is cold and just fires everybody every time they cost a nickel more, and this and that and the other thing. I'll give you, now this didn't have to do with OSHA so much, but we were at one point building condos in Mexico. And this is an example of where, people will spend money based on this. Time is money in business. And basically, to make a long story short, we imported Mexican-American bricklayers into Mexico to lay brick in Mexico because the Mexican bricklayers laid bricks at a tenth the rate of the Mexican-American bricklayers. In other words, we brought down bilingual Chicanos from the United States to come and work on our project and paid them. The minimum wage in Mexico is less than $7 a day, and we were paying our bricklayers well over $20 an hour, and they knew how to lay brick safely. But the difference was these guys laid a lot of brick. They didn't fuck around. And unfortunately, in Mexico, our experience was there are plenty of other Mexicans that we dealt with that were wonderful and did a great job. I mean, if you've never seen a boveda, I'm not going to go into what a boveda is, but it's just artwork, let me just say. But the productivity of our American workers were so far superior to our Mexican workers that we would readily import them, which was a whole level of bureaucracy and fees we had to pay to bring them in to do the job. It's a myth that business only uses the cheapest possible. Since time is money, you use the most productive labor possible. And part of productivity is keeping them safe. So do we need all of those OSHA regulations? Do we need to comply? Well, we don't have a choice, and that meant me hiring full-time employees that did nothing but make sure, a full-time safety officer that we paid almost $60,000 a year to do nothing but comply with OSHA regulations and make sure our job sites were safe, when in fact the subcontractors were doing that and it was being done anyway because it's just good business, which I'm sure is the case in the vast majority of sites. And the people that would put their employees into harm's way are going to do it anyway, regardless of OSHA regulations. So the question is, are any of those regulations necessary? And all they do is add to the cost. So every condo bought cost 10% more than it had to cost because of the pure cost of regulation. Okay? All of us pay for this shit, whether you think so or not. Everything. Go into a hardware store and buy a ladder. And look at how many labels are on that ladder on how to use that ladder, and that's all about regulation and lawsuit avoidance. And go in and count them. You're going to count 17 labels on the average ladder on how to use. If you are so stupid that you don't know how to use safely a ladder, my question is how many regulations are going to save you? If you buy a bottle of a toxic substance, like let's say weed killer. Oh, no. I'll use a different example. The idiot who drank fish tank cleaner here in Phoenix, Arizona, where I live, when that chloroquine or whatever the fuck it was called came out as a possible treatment for COVID, some idiot here in Phoenix and his wife drank fish tank cleaner because they saw quinine or something on the label. I don't know what the fuck it was. And one of them died and the other one ended up in a coma. And, from where I sit, that's natural selection. But there were warning labels on that bottle, which added to the cost of the bottle of fish tank cleaner. But I'm telling you that millions of people have cleaned their fish tanks with that fish tank cleaner, I am sure, and never thought to drink it. There was no need for those regulations. Most regulation is just redundant shit we already know that we don't need. But all of it costs our economy another 10% of the economy every year. And think of how many jobs and how many raises and how much productivity we squander complying with regulation. And an anti-political government would cut regulation way, way down. Now, President Trump, to his credit, has been slowing the growth of regulation. But an anti-political government would basically rescind almost all of it. Not all of it. Not all of it. There have to be regulations on some things, like, for example, setting pollution levels that are reasonable for, but that can be done at the state level. The Environmental Protection Agency passes issues, not passes, it doesn't have to subject itself to Congress. It issues myriads of environmental regulations. For example, out here in Arizona where I live, cattle ranchers have to comply with bullshit regulations on how they feed their cattle and how many, coyotes they can kill and, how they have to fence and how much. These guys have been raising cattle on these lands for a couple of centuries. And the fucking EPA is telling them how to run their land. Honest to God. Now, could a state regulator do that just as well, but because they're familiar with the Arizona Cattle Growers Association and they have an intimate relationship with them, come up with common sense regulations that both the cattle growers and the regulators can live with on behalf of the people of the state? I would say yes. So one of the federal departments I would get rid of altogether, and therefore all their regulations in an anti-political world, would be the Environmental Protection Agency and OSHA. Again, state regulators are closer to business, so they know who's safe and who isn't. They just drive around Phoenix. You can see projects everywhere. Every state regulator can see that. There is no need. And if a state does it, number one, it has more common sense, and number two, it's a lot less expensive because it's a lot smaller bureaucracy that are a lot closer to the people that it's regulating. Again, I'm not an anarchist. I'm just saying that there's no need for federal regulation when the states can do it. And by the way, the Constitution is clear on that. There's been just a huge regulatory overreach since Franklin Roosevelt was president, but that is too long a subject for a 30-minute podcast. But believe me, that's when all this shit began, and it really accelerated under Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s. Now that brings us to the third area that I'm going to discuss today, which is administrative law. Now, I'll bet you that if I didn't talk to you about it, you would have no idea what administrative law is. Let me explain it to you. The law that Congress passes is just the beginning. Then what happens? See, Congress people, whether they're representatives in the House of Representatives or whether they're senators, spend 40 hours a week on average. Google this if you think I'm making this shit up. It's going to seem so strange. It will seem like it's not real. But please, fact check me. You're going to find out I'm telling you the truth. They spend an average of 40 hours a week raising money for their next election. Because remember, the average congressperson has to raise, or representative has to raise about 11.9 million under current averages, and the average senator needs about 17 to 18 million to run for Senate. These are jobs that pay $174,000 a year. So you got to ask yourself how much corruption is going on in that bullshit. But anyway, putting that aside, this is not the corruption discussion. Because they spend 40 hours a week, they neither read nor understand how to institute the bills they pass. So in other words, they pass a law to do X or Y or Z. But they've never read the fucking bill. They just go along with it because their leadership, Democrat or Republican, tells them to. So either they're pandering to the left or they're pandering to the right. And they pass this bill and then they hand it off to the corresponding federal department, who then passes again, I'm misusing the word pass, then issues, because they don't have to pass a fucking thing, there's no voting going on, they issue administrative laws to enact the law in the spirit of what Congress desired them to do, even though they weren't part of the process or are unelected and answered to nobody. And these administrative laws cost us another 10 to 20% of GDP and put people in jail even. These carry the full weight of law, both criminal and civil fines, and by unelected people. And this used to never happen prior to the 1960s. But when the explosion of money and the welfare state happened at the same time, corrupting the entire process, these Congress people, whether you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, guys always talk about, we're going to go to Washington and do something. Basically, I'm paraphrasing, but, they consider, unless they pass laws, issue laws, co-sponsor laws, put things into action, they don't feel like they've done anything. Well, all they've done is add to the load of administrative laws because they don't know what the fuck they're voting for. They get an idea up in their heads, and then they pass the law, and then they hand it off to the federal department that it corresponds with, and then some bureaucrat who wants to justify his or her existence in some room starts issuing administrative laws. And the Supreme Court sadly, has been very remiss in repealing. They've repealed some, but there's just not enough time for these 9 justices to repeal all the administrative laws or make them unconstitutional, which is what they really are if you really think about it. Administrative law is a wild constitutional overreach by the federal government that they do under the guise of what's called the Commerce Clause, and this is just... I'm going to get into the weeds and I'm going to bore the shit out of you, but believe it or not, if you break the law, there's about a 9 out of 10 chance the law you're going to break, and you are breaking laws right now you don't even know about. There's just so many of these fucking laws that you just can't keep track of them. And if you're in business or you're working in an executive function or you're, middle management or above, you're probably breaking some fucking administrative law that if some prosecutor gets a wild hair up his or her ass to come after you, you can go to jail for, that it was put into place by unelected people enacting laws because your fucking congressman and your fucking senator has to spend fucking 40 hours a week raising fucking money to run for their fucking $174,000 a year job. The motherfuckers. Overuse the word fuck a little bit, but it really gets to me. This is why, as boring as these subjects sound, income tax, regulation, administrative tax, these things, about a third of your money is being wasted on this shit every fucking year between taxes, and it's buried in the cost of everything that you do. Even if you're never jailed, even if you never violate a rule or you're never charged with the violation of one of these stupid fucking rules, you're paying for it. You're paying for it with every box of Cheerios. You're paying for it on every ladder you buy, every hammer you buy, every tire you buy, every piece of wire you buy. If you're a home woodworker, you're paying for it in the tools that you buy. There is nothing you could possibly do where you aren't eating the cost of this shit, and life would become immeasurably better and the economy immeasurably bigger and your paycheck much larger if we just went to a simple national sales tax, repealed all the federal regulations and let the states do it. And the states would, again, I'm not an anarchist. I'm just saying the closer government is to you, state and local, the more, it's in touch with you and what your needs really are. As I often say and have in other videos, Wyoming is very different from New York and California and Florida. Every state, we're 50 little countries with open borders, and your local people can regulate. There are probably no cattle growers in, I don't know, let me pick a fucking state, Rhode Island. Okay, there's probably no Rhode Island. I don't know. If there is, folks, don't mail me shit just because I'm ignorant. But I doubt there's a Rhode Island Cattle Growers Association. But out here in Arizona, there sure as shit is, and they're regulated by the fucking EPA and the Department of the Interior as well in Washington, D.C. that doesn't have a fucking idea what goes on in Arizona. It's just a bunch of kids who went to college for environmental law who sit there back in those offices that justify their fucking existence and make these fucking cattle growers miserable. And every time you buy a steak and every time you buy beef ribs and every time you buy hamburger, you're paying for it. Believe me. Think of how much life would be better without this shit and how much happier we would all be. Our happiness quotient would go up. And that's where I'm going to leave it today. Okay, so one more time. In an anti-political government, national sales tax, everybody pays, even the poor, live in our means, cut back regulation, cut back administrative law. Then, before you do any of that shit, subscribe. Subscribe to Antipolitism. Please subscribe to this podcast. Click on notifications. Share this with your friends. And I hope you learned something today. I know, just the very title of this. When I first thought to do it, I thought, Jesus Christ, what a boring fucking time. But you got to understand this stuff, okay? You can't just live on the surface of things. You got to dive into them. So pick up a copy of A Radical Reset free through Amazon Kindle. You can read it on any electronic device. You can read it on your smartphone. Or if you're one of these people that likes hard copies, and people in my generation in particular love a good hard copy and like the dog-ear pages, buy the paperback. Anyway, that's it. Have a wonderful day. This is E.08. Until next time, signing off.